Welcome to this IQT Podcast, exploring technology trends and their impact on national security. I'm Sarah Sewall, and today we're going to explore the future of the U.S. Global Positioning System, commonly known as GPS. GPS is a constellation of satellites that transmit positioning, navigation, and timing, or PNT data, down to us on Earth. And in the 1970s, the United States began pioneering this technology for military use. Today, it's vital for countless civilian purposes, including critical infrastructure. Because PNT data is so important, other leading states have developed their own worldwide navigation satellite systems. First, the then Soviet Union, and then quite a bit later, the European Union developed the GLONASS and Galileo systems respectively, providing free PNT data worldwide. GPS, though, has remained the most popular and has been considered the technical gold standard for some time. Just a few years ago, though, China joined this elite club of PNT providers. I wrote about China's Beidou system in a paper published by Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs earlier this year. Beidou has liberated China from its dependence on the U.S. GPS system. Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping called it one of China's most important achievements in the last 40 years. This Beidou system has global coverage, and it includes many advanced features, which has, of course, fueled interest in the relative capabilities of the U.S. GPS system. Long-planned modernization of GPS satellites has been slow. Some observers argue that GPS is losing its status as the PNT gold standard, even as civilian dependence upon PNT data continues to grow. So here today to help us understand the future of GPS are two longtime experts who have distinct yet complementary perspectives. Scott Pace, welcome to the podcast. Can you please tell us about yourself and your career?
That's really dangerous, asking an academic to talk about themselves. I'll just focus on GPS involvement as the topic today. I was in the Commerce Department, the Office of Space Commerce, in the early 90s, around the time of the first Gulf War, and we were looking at commercial stats and saw that the GPS market, which, while tiny compared to, say, commercial communication satellites, was growing really rapidly. The first derivative was all up. So that sort of caught our attention. During the Clinton administration, I was working for the RAND Corporation and supporting the Office of Science Technology Policy, and helped with the background studies and support for what became the first national policy on GPS issued in 1996 and announced by then Vice President Al Gore. I became more involved in some of the spectrum issues for GPS in 97 at the World Radio Communications Conference, where a group of European countries attempted to reallocate a portion of the lower band for GPS for a mobile satellite service system, and then spent the next 3 years going around the world lobbying and other countries to protect the spectrum and for GPS, and what later would become Galileo after the Europeans reconsidered. And then in the last several years, I've been spending a number of efforts in protecting GPS really domestically from terrestrial communications proposals that have sought to, again, repurpose the spectrum in and around GPS. So fighting for terrain in spectrum has kind of been a long-term theme. One other thing I might add is also in the Commerce Department in the early 90s, we rewrote the export control laws and wound up defining GPS military receivers rather narrowly as those that contain cryptographic capabilities or navigation warfare capabilities. But in general, the vast bulk of GPS receiver equipment was a general destination item and could be exported freely. And I like to think that helped contribute to the wide popularity and spread of GPS from that regulatory move.
Fantastic. Well, that is quite an involved and multidimensional exposure to GPS issues. Steve Poizner, thanks for joining us. you were among the first entrepreneurs to develop consumer products using GPS. Can you share your journey?
About 25 years ago, here in Silicon Valley, a few of my colleagues and I were quite stunned by the fact that in news reports, people would be using their cell phones. They would be dialing 911 from the cell phone in an emergency situation. There were reports of people driving off of cliffs and getting stuck, heart attacks, other medical emergencies, major car crashes. And then when they're talking to the 911 operator in this emergency situation, they couldn't be located. So we started a company called SnapTrack back in the 1990s that worked to address a recent Federal Communications Commission mandate at the time. And that mandate was on the wireless industry. You got to find some way to locate these wireless callers in emergency situations. It was a very interesting competitive dynamic that broke out. People recognized the big opportunity there. And we started a company to try to figure out a way to put a GPS receiver into a cell phone. There were dozens of other competitors, all really focusing on terrestrial solutions where you put gear at every cell site and triangulate on the cell phone caller. And that was considered to be the best approach because that way you didn't need to modify the cell phone. But as it turned out, terrestrial triangulation techniques don't work very well for a whole bunch of reasons. And GPS was the vastly superior approach. And I'm really, really pleased to have been part of the team that brought GPS to the masses. When Scott was working on this in the 1990s, as he was mentioning, it was a system that was dominated by military applications. But now, as Sarah, as you even mentioned, now civilian applications dwarf the military applications. And so we did figure out how to put a GPS receiver into a cell phone. We were the first to do that. There were a lot of technical problems and challenges. These GPS satellites, they're not LEOs. They're way up there. They're 11,000 miles up. The signals are super weak by the time they hit the Earth. And so putting a receiver of these super weak signals inside of a noisy cell phone is a very technically challenging problem. And then on the business side, let me just say that the wireless industry had no interest, ironically, in putting GPS receivers in their mobile phones. I remember the CEO of a major wireless carrier telling me, why on earth would anyone want a GPS receiver into a cell phone? So we had to overcome some of that too. But Qualcomm ended up acquiring our company, and thanks to that marriage, there are literally billions of these receivers out there now, based on that early SnapTrack technology, and that's I've been part of that sector for a long time. Just started a new GPS startup company in Silicon Valley a few years ago to really focus on these new upgraded satellite signals, which I'm sure we'll talk about later here.
Fantastic. All right. Well, again, welcome to you both. So, Scott, let's start with some history. Can you give us the backstory behind GPS's development and why and how it became so important, first to the military and then to civilians?
One of the founders of GPS, Brad Parkinson, was an Air Force colonel who was part of the original sort of founding of this, and he tells a wonderfully detailed story about it back in the 70s. But the main thing to know is that it was not really welcomed by the Air Force initially. It kind of had to fight for its existence, and the idea of using satellites for geolocation. There were some ideas from the Navy. There's some ideas from the Air Force. And it was really some of the civilian leadership inside of DoD that kind of persevered and kept the program going. The very, very first Navstar satellite was launched in 1974, but it was pretty much an experimental program for many, many years. And so when it came to kind of maybe widespread public notice in the first Gulf War around 91, it still really was an experimental system. It wasn't really fully operational. Even so, it played a diplomatic role. In 1983, the Soviets shot down a errant passenger airliner, Korean Air 007, killing all aboard, including a congressman. And as part of the reaction to that, President Reagan made an announcement that GPS signals would be made available to the international aviation community, and making a commitment so that tragedies like that, of course, would be less likely or shouldn't happen again. So it went from being a technical idea championed by Air Force civilians over reluctant military to being something that then saw potential value as a air safety service, to something that became a war-winning capability in the first Gulf War, and then a few years later was declared fully operational. The military applications, of course, were the predominant reason that it was built, why it was paid for by taxpayer money. In the beginning, there was actually a line for user equipment, paying to develop. I remember that some of the very first user equipment I actually saw as an undergraduate was essentially a rack of electronics that filled, part of a Winnebago test vehicle, out in Sandia Labs. And the story over the years is that rack of electronics shrunk down to a box, and then with the work that Steve and his colleagues did, shrunk it down into a chip until the GPS device disappeared inside the other application. So going from a rack inside. In the 1990s, there were a number of people separately all talking about GPS. So the aviation people, of course, were intrigued but wary. It would become more important to the military, certainly after the first Gulf War. And there were people, of course, concerned about ballistic missile proliferation, that adversaries could use the signals to guide ballistic missiles against us. And there was also the economic growth. You're seeing it showing up in survey and mapping technologies, rapidly growing, adding productivity and infrastructure. But from a policy perspective, those groups are all just in separate silos. They don't necessarily talk to each other. But if you were in the White House, or at least supporting the White House, like myself and some others were, you could see this theme popping up over and over again. And that led to writing the first policy around GPS that kind of cut across these different sectors as an example of a dual-use technology. And one of the things that I think helped GPS be successful was not just the policy recognition, but I think fundamentally from an industry standpoint, the industry thought of it as an information technology. Now, this was crucial because if you went to Europe, they thought of things like satellite navigation, if they had heard about it, as akin to Arianespace or maybe Airbus. It was an aerospace technology. If you talk to Japan, who took an early lead in car navigation systems, I think at one point they had 40% of the world car market navigation. They had that because they had an early lead as a small, compact country in digital maps. So Japan was digitally mapped much sooner than the U.S. was. So that combination of digital maps, guidance systems, and a piece of electronics rolled out into the aftermarket. Now, you could go to Akihabara and buy a car navigation device, and there was nothing on it to tell you that the signals from this came from an Air Force satellite, halfway to GEO, but it was just a car navigation device. So they thought of GPS as kind of this consumer product kind of thing, and the Europeans as an aerospace product. I think the U.S. companies, like Steve, like Trimble Navigation, like Garmin, Magellan, and others, thought of it as an IT technology that was much more generalizable, and I think that also led to its spread and proliferation. So, like other dual-use technologies, the internet, radar, it comes out of the military, but then spreads into the civilian economy.
So transitioning over to you, Steve, you're an entrepreneur, and your current startup relies on GPS. Can you talk to us about how you evaluate GPS's capabilities in this broader context of more competitors and the more recent arrival of Beidou?
Now, let me first say that the Air Force and Scott and his colleagues, I mean, the invention and deployment of GPS should go down as one of the most important inventions in the last 100 years. It's had such a huge, profound impact on the safety and productivity of billions of people. We as a country should be very, very proud of it. So now I'm about to mention we're falling behind now, and it's I'm sad to have to report that, but it is what it is. And one reason why I think it's important for all of us here to speak up is that we know that the military is so busy working on lots of different things, and it's important that the civilian users speak up loudly so that it gets the attention that it needs. But we've built this next generation. GNSS is the more generic term, Global Navigation Satellite Systems. We've built this general purpose GNSS receiver that has these on-off switches for the U.S. system GPS, the European system Galileo, the China system Beidou. And so what we have is a system that focuses on these new modernized signals. Scott mentioned 1974. That's like, I think GPS just celebrated its 50th birthday, anniversary from its invention. But that original L1 signal in the L band, 1.5 gigahertz, it's an old signal. 50 years ago, there weren't the same techniques that are available today. So the new modernized GPS signal, called L5, also in the L band, it's a modern signal. No surprise, because the new upgraded signal takes advantage of all these new error correction techniques, and it's a stronger signal, and it's harder to jam and spoof, and it's got a lot of amazing characteristics. So our receiver can receive this new upgraded so-called L5 band signal from these various countries. And it's a fact that we've are losing that race. So we invented GPS, the whole world adopts it, and now the race to upgrade to this new L5 signal, we're behind. So there's 24 satellites about in each of these constellations, plus or minus a few. You need about 24 satellites to get global coverage. You have in this race to upgrade, you have the Europeans that have fully upgraded their 28 satellites. They all have the new L5 signal now, called E5 in Europe. The L5 signal in China is called B2. All 27 of the China Beidou satellites have been upgraded. In the United States, on the other hand, only 18 of the 24 have been upgraded. And so the Air Force labels these satellites as pre-operational, and there, some reports indicate that they're maybe close to a decade behind their own forecasts of upgrading these satellites. So that's kind of one major difference, is that we don't have a complete constellation of these new, modern, amazing signals, while China and Europe does. Some people do believe that China now has the most precise signals. We compare them every day. I mentioned we have these on-off switches, so we can tell you for a fact how, the quality here. When it comes to signal strength, for a variety of technical reasons, their signals are a little bit stronger, meaning that you can receive slightly weaker signals and process them. The time to first fix, which is one of the important measurements, how fast does it take for you to get a location fix? Slightly faster with the China signal. So combined with the fact that they have a lot more satellites up there, we're now behind, for sure, absolutely. Now, some people will argue that the quality of the clocks that are in these GPS satellites are better than anyone else in the world, and there's some reason to believe that's true. But there's other academic researchers that are not so sure. Anyhow, bottom line, we're behind, and it's important to put a spotlight on that fact. China has 1 billion users now of its system, and because of all the different things I mentioned, it provides the best location accuracy of anybody right now.
So let me switch back to you, Scott. So Steve is describing building products that can take inputs from every single GNSS system. Does it matter whether or not Americans are using, a modernized GPS if they can use modernized systems from other countries?
Yes and no. On one hand, everything Steve says, I think it's true in terms of these characteristics. Really, the question is, how much does that matter? On one hand, I really hope that L5 system builds out more rapidly. He's correct. L5 not only is a bit nicer design, but it's in aviation safety band, so it's in a piece of spectrum that's protected for safety purposes. I will point out that the decision for for the 1176 megahertz that L5 sits on was actually quite controversial and protracted, and it took Vice President Al Gore to kind of finally, make the decision. And in 1999, okay, so we're talking 24 years ago, the decision for selecting this was done. And so it begs the question about, well, how come, since that decision was made 24 years ago, what's been the problem? The problem is that policy has always emphasized that GPS needs to be the predominant military service. It only secondarily serves commercial purposes. The reason GPS was built was for military purposes, and then civilian users were allowed access to it for free. And that meant that the GPS, keeping it available for free and so forth, and meant that civilian needs were not prioritized to the same degree that military needs were, because the military was paying for it. Now, there have been efforts over the years to have Transportation Department as kind of like the lead entity for civil users. NASA also plays a bit, but more in space. And one of the problems that DOT has had is keeping its share of the bargain in providing funding for the civil line. There have been a number of years where DOT has proposed and sought funding for civil improvements to GPS, and then either it didn't make it through the White House, or it made it through the White House and didn't make it through Congress, or it made it through Congress and the money was earmarked for some other purpose. So there hasn't been a dedicated funding source for DOT to keep up its part of the bargain. And you can imagine the frustration this creates for the Air Force, who says, okay, I planned for you to be here. I'm not going to pay for your requirements, but I'm happy to be supportive, if you show up with your resources. We've been able to do that for some things, like, to pick an obscure example, laser retroreflectors that give you better geodetic positioning of the satellite that NASA has paid for and helped pay for the integration. But that's a much more modest cost than adding L5 to the system. So while from a policy standpoint, we've recognized GPS as dual use and it's governed at kind of a national level, when it comes to funding, the priorities go toward DoD, and DoD requirements are being met. I mean, they will be very clear that their requirements are being met. Now, from a commercial or civil standpoint, the counter strategy, because of maybe not building everything into the satellite, has been to build augmentation systems. The FAA and Transportation Department were not able to get a kind of insight into the reliability and resiliency of GPS at a very granular level that they needed for their air traffic systems. And so they built the wide area augmentation system, which effectively is an augmentation overlay that independently checks validation because it doesn't trust GPS. And many other countries do the same thing, have these augmentation systems. In terms of how the commercial market has responded, I can't, again, Steve might be able to correct me on this, but there's virtually no consumer uses of GPS which are pure GPS signals. They're all augmented in some way, whether from Wi-Fi, cell networks, mapping systems. It's layers and layers of systems. So multi-GNSS is simply one more layer on top of the base utility signal. What really matters, what I think is most important for GPS, is it to be reliable. The integrity and availability are the most important questions. The actual accuracy obviously needs to be acceptable, but that's less important than it be trustworthy. The Russians, GLONASS system, there used to be a time in the 90s when people built joint GLONASS GPS systems, and everybody thought it was great to use these two systems until they abandoned them because the GLONASS system, the satellites would be unhealthy and the Russians wouldn't set them unhealthy, and people used bad data that they then had to remove. And so the market for multi-GNSS systems basically collapsed at that point because it was worse than useless. What's great about the Chinese so far is that they are operating with seemingly fairly reliable. They have not had the kind of trustworthiness problems that the Russians suffered from. And so they, again, should be commended for their performance. On the other hand, that's not really the most important thing in a multi-GNSS and augmentation world. It maybe hurts our pride a little bit, but it's not the existential kind of threat that I think sometimes people worry about.
Well, let's come back to this issue of GPS's own capabilities, and you've both described, sort of the multidimensional pursuit of PNT. But the reality, I think, is for most consumers, if GPS were to go down or there were going to be disruption that was more broadly felt across GNSS, people would be pretty upset. I mean, the impact on our economies, not to mention our transportation systems and everything else, would be severe. And so, the question I think for viewers, or the question I'd like to ask is, if this is the silent utility that it's often described in academic circles, who speaks on behalf of the silent utility? How do you make that case for modernization and for greater anti-jamming and the kinds of features that Steve was talking about? So, Scott, from a bureaucratic standpoint, who's out there lobbying, their congresspersons for GPS modernization? And then over to you, Steve, what is the future that we should be looking at, and what is the longer term vision for how we think about both the enhanced reliability, to Scott's point, but also the continued advancement in features? So, Scott, first to you.
Well, I think, again, just as I described different approaches to thinking about GPS as a industrial item, aerospace, IT, or consumer product, there's also been these sorts of debates about, do I look on GPS maybe as another analogy rather than utility, as like an operating system? We have essentially GPS is kind of like Linux. It's a little crufty, but it's free. It's there. It's installed in everything. It's a basic system that everybody builds on. And then somebody else comes along, say like Europe, and says, we'd like you to use our new version of Windows Vista. And here's has all these great applications and things, on it, and we want you to pay more for it. Do you really want to put the complexity in space, or do you want to put the complexity on the ground? I think there are arguments to be made for improving the reliability of the signal. Certainly going to L5, I think, is plainly justifiable for no other reason than public safety in the safety band. There are certainly arguments for improving the L1 signal. There's a thing called L1C, civil signal, which is to then be more interoperable with Galileo. There are identified purposes that we already have approved that we frankly should fund and do. But after that, I'm thinking the complexity really needs to be on the ground or in different space systems. The ground so far has been all these different augmentations I've mentioned. The new space systems, there are a category of new ideas, and Steve, you probably know about these, of LEO PNT designs. Zona is one that has come up, where it's a sort of small net, not small, several hundred sort of satellites up there that provide additional signals that can integrate onto a chip to provide better accuracy and better availability, and very, very interesting. And there's some interesting work being done now to make sure it's compatible in spectrum, because as somebody who's fought multiple decades of spectrum wars over interference, I'm not interested in having more interference, but some initial signs are promising, still to be demonstrated. And if that were to happen, we would see maybe a new ecosystem. I think, just as Steve, some of the things that you're doing about applications for L5 and others. So the innovation doesn't have to only be in the satellite system itself, the original Linux system. It can also be in these other applications. To date, they've been on the ground. There's some potential for that to be in space. And so rather than trying to compete with the Chinese dollar for dollar in a large centralized system that, frankly, I think we could do, and it wouldn't succeed very much, I'd like to see ways we can innovate around that and build upon the large installed base that we already have, but maybe in a more decentralized way than the Chinese system.
So, Steve, you represent one of the fundamental differences in this game, which is that when you're thinking about GNSS systems, you're thinking about government expenditures, government systems. So we have one train of thought, which is how much are we investing in those government systems? And then, as Scott was alluding to, we've got the private sector doing offering all kinds of different augmentation and potentially new paradigms for thinking about this. Talk about what you see in the future, both for your own company and your own thinking. How much do we invest in the GPS system? How much do we innovate around it?
Right. Scott's right. There's lots of great augmentation work happening. Scott mentioned, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, assist, cell tower network, information that helps you to add to the location information. Gyros, every cell phone now has accelerometers and gyros and altimeters and all kinds of things that also feed into the location calculation. But with that said, I do want to emphasize the importance, though, of having a absolute location technology as the anchor. And so there's nothing like GPS or its equivalents around the world as an absolutely critical component. So the augmentation helps you operate indoors or in heavily blocked environments, that kind of thing. But without that anchor system, the whole thing would collapse. Goes back to what I was saying, 25 years ago when we were in the big race to figure out how to comply with the FCC mandate. If you can't really depend on terrestrial navigation or triangulation, there's just too much blockage. Sometimes you're not seeing multiple cell towers. I mean, having that satellite trajectory and views, is really critical to the way modern civilian location technology operates. But with that said, absolutely backup systems that are LEO based, or even some terrestrial backup systems, augmentation systems is the wave of the future. Are absolutely critical to make GPS work in more difficult environments, or when there's some interference or jamming to deal with. If I can just go back to what do we need to do tomorrow though, and how do we allocate resources? I mean, the fact that our L5 upgrade is such a huge upgrade. Every time we get an upgrade on our cell phone, is it really, a few little things? Is it really that big of a deal, these upgrades? Well, the difference between L5 and L1 is massive, Scott mentioned another big advantage that I didn't even mention earlier, and that is that it's in this, reserved part of the L band with a lot less interference. So the government, the U.S. government has its role and the private sector has its role, but it's important for civilian users, to pound the table, finish the upgrade. That's the first thing that would have a profound impact. 18 satellites that have been upgraded is not a complete system. And there's been articles written that there's 4 of these new L5 satellites sitting in warehouses that haven't been launched yet because there's other priorities. And in addition to that, various military folks have told us that the satellites were built in such a robust way that they're not, breaking as fast or falling apart as fast as they thought. And so some of the older satellites continue to operate, and there are decision makers in the Pentagon that go, well, until these things break, we're not launching the new satellites. And so that's in my humble opinion, the wrong way to think about it. When you have the new technology ready, paid for and built, you got to get them launched and up there.
I think as one of the our colleagues out at Space Command says, I've got GPS satellites under control that are old enough to buy a beer.
That's right. And by the way, it's worth mentioning that there's other things that the Pentagon's having to deal with here. The ground control system built on IBM 360s using Fortran code, they're having trouble. There's GAO reports about how that whole ground control system upgrade is way behind schedule too. There's a lot that needs to be focused on here to get our GPS system up and modernized. I think part of the problem is that the military has its hands full on lots of different things, and the civilian side of the equation needs to be focused on more, and that requires a spotlight put on what would happen. It's more than losing access to Uber or DoorDash. Every cell tower has a GPS receiver for timing synchronization. The banking system uses it. It's so fundamental part of our private sector economy. It'd be catastrophic if our system became dysfunctional for some reason, which is why I do think it's worth this country investing the resources it needs to be self-sufficient. That doesn't mean in general day-to-day operation we can't augment the system like Scott says, absolutely great, or combine it with other systems from Europe or other places, that's fine too. But if when push comes to shove, this country better have a system that it can rely on itself, that's modernized and ready to go.
Well, thank you both so much for helping us unpack so many of the different dimensions around the question of whither GPS. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. For more information related to this topic, you can look for our upcoming podcast that is entitled How Resilient is America's PNT Data? And you can subscribe to the IQT podcast. You can leave us your reviews or comments, and you can also check out IQT's website at www.iqt.org for other content about cutting edge technology. Thank you all.